The aftermath of World War I and the seeds of Hitler's rise. In November 1918, Germany signed the armistice ending the First World War, a moment that would later be weaponized by extremists who promoted the stab-in-the-back myth, the false claim that Germany had not truly been defeated, but rather betrayed by internal enemies. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh conditions on Germany. The nation lost approximately 13% of its pre-war territory, including resource-rich regions like Alsace-Lorraine. The treaty required Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and pay massive reparations of 132 billion gold marks. Additionally, severe military restrictions were imposed, limiting the army to 100,000 men and prohibiting certain types of weapons. The economic impact was devastating. Unable to pay the reparations, Germany began printing money, leading to hyperinflation that reached its peak in 1923. At its worst, prices doubled every few days. Workers carried wages home in wheelbarrows, and money lost value so quickly that people rushed to spend it immediately. Middle-class savings were wiped out, and many who had been prosperous found themselves destitute. The newly established Weimar Republic struggled to maintain political stability. Between 1919 and 1923, Germany saw multiple attempted coups from both left and right-wing groups. The government faced approximately 370 political assassinations, mostly of democratic politicians. This violence fostered a sense that democracy was failing to provide basic security and order. The psychological impact on the German population was profound. A proud nation that had considered itself a great power now faced military occupation in the Rhineland, international humiliation, and economic collapse. Many Germans, especially former soldiers, felt betrayed and desperately sought explanations for their nation's downfall. This created fertile ground for radical political movements, offering simple explanations and promising national renewal. This period saw the emergence of numerous paramilitary groups called Freikorps, composed largely of former soldiers who refused to accept defeat. These groups would later provide both members and tactical experience to Nazi stormtroopers. Their violence helped destabilize the young democracy while normalizing political brutality. Hitler's early political development. Adolf Hitler's path to political extremism began in the trenches of World War I, where he served as a corporal in the German army. The war provided him with a sense of purpose and belonging he had previously lacked. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler was recovering from a gas attack in a military hospital. Like many veterans, he experienced the nation's defeat as a personal trauma and refused to accept that Germany had been genuinely defeated on the battlefield. After the war, Hitler remained in the army and was assigned to gather intelligence on political groups in Munich. In this capacity, he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or DAP, in September 1919. The small nationalist group impressed him with its anti-Semitic, anti-communist ideology. He joined as member number 55, quickly recognizing that his gift for public speaking could elevate both the party and himself. Within the DAP, Hitler refined his political ideology. He combined several existing strands of thought: extreme nationalism, racial anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and the concept of Lebensraum, living space. He proved particularly adept at tailoring his message to his audience, emphasizing economic grievances when speaking to workers and the threat of communism when addressing middle-class groups. The party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP or Nazi Party, in 1920, and Hitler became its leader in 1921. He established the Sturmabteilung, SA or Stormtroopers, as the party's paramilitary wing, using them to protect meetings and attack political opponents. This combination of inflammatory rhetoric and street violence became a hallmark of the Nazi movement. In November 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in the Beer Hall Putsch. Believing that the time was right for a nationalist revolution, he and his followers tried to take control of Munich, planning to march on Berlin afterward. The coup failed when Bavarian police forces confronted the Nazi marchers, killing 16 party members. Hitler was arrested and put on trial for treason. The trial proved a turning point. Hitler used the courtroom as a propaganda platform, gaining national attention for his nationalist message. Though convicted, he received a lenient sentence of 5 years, but served only 9 months in Landsberg prison. During this imprisonment, he dictated Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess, laying out his political ideology and future plans. The failure of the putsch taught Hitler a crucial lesson. He would need to gain power through legal means, even while maintaining the threat of violence. This legal revolution strategy would prove crucial to his later success. The time in prison also allowed him to reflect and refine his leadership style, emerging with a stronger determination to reshape German society according to his radical vision. The rebuilding of the Nazi Party, 1924 to 1929. After his release from prison in December 1924, Hitler set about rebuilding and reorganizing the Nazi Party with a new strategic approach. Rather than attempting another violent coup, he focused on gaining power through legal means while maintaining the threat of violence as a backing force. This period of relative economic stability in Germany, known as the Golden Twenties, allowed Hitler to methodically build his political organization. The Nazi Party's propaganda machinery became increasingly sophisticated under Hitler's direction and that of Joseph Goebbels, who became propaganda chief in 1928. They mastered modern communication techniques, using radio, film, massive rallies, and striking visual imagery. The swastika symbol, the Hitler salute, and carefully choreographed mass meetings were all designed to create an impression of power and unity. Goebbels understood that emotional appeals were more effective than rational arguments, and the party's messaging focused on simple, repeated themes: national humiliation, the need for renewal, and the identification of scapegoats. The party's organizational structure expanded significantly during this period. The SA, Sturmabteilung, grew into a large paramilitary force that intimidated opponents and provided security at Nazi events. In 1925, Hitler established the SS, Schutzstaffel, as his personal bodyguard unit, which would later become the most feared organization in Nazi Germany. Youth groups, women's organizations, and professional associations were created to penetrate every aspect of German society. Hitler deliberately targeted the middle class, who had been economically devastated by the hyperinflation of 1923 and feared both communism and economic instability. His message combined nationalism and socialism, promising to restore German greatness while protecting private property. The party presented itself as the only force capable of preventing a communist revolution, while also offering radical solutions to Germany's problems. The Nazi Party's electoral strategy was sophisticated. They tailored their message to different audiences, emphasizing economic issues to workers, traditional values to conservatives, and nationalism to the middle class. Hitler himself proved to be an exceptionally effective public speaker, able to sense and manipulate crowd emotions. The party developed a network of local organizations that maintained continuous contact with voters, something other parties had not done. However, despite these efforts, the Nazi Party remained relatively small by the end of the 1920s. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, they received only 2.6% of the vote. This would change dramatically with the onset of the Great Depression, which created the conditions for the party's rapid rise to power. The organizational structure and propaganda techniques developed during these relatively quiet years would prove crucial when crisis struck. The period ended with the party poised for growth, but still on the political fringe. The Nazis had built an effective organization and refined their message, but they needed a crisis to make their radical solutions appear necessary to a broader segment of the German population. That crisis would arrive with the stock market crash of 1929. The Great Depression's role in the rise of the Nazi Party. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression created a perfect storm that the Nazi Party would exploit to gain power. For Germany, already struggling with war reparations and dependent on American loans, the economic collapse was catastrophic. By 1932, Industrial production had fallen to about 58% of its 1928 level, and approximately 6 million Germans, nearly 30% of the workforce, were unemployed. The economic crisis quickly became a political crisis. The Weimar Republic's coalition governments proved unable to agree on measures to address the depression. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, appointed in 1930, implemented strict austerity measures, cutting government spending and raising taxes in an attempt to balance the budget. These policies, while financially orthodox, only deepened the economic crisis and further eroded public confidence in democratic governance. The depth of the crisis radicalized German politics. Millions of middle-class Germans who had lost their savings for the second time in a decade, first through hyperinflation, now through bank failures and unemployment, became increasingly receptive to anti-democratic alternatives. Small business owners, farmers, and white-collar workers, traditionally the backbone of democratic stability, began moving toward political extremes. The Nazi Party was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this desperation. Hitler offered simple explanations for complex problems, blaming Germany's troubles on specific groups: Jews, communists, democratic politicians, and foreign powers. The party's propaganda portrayed Hitler as a strong leader who could restore order and prosperity. Their message combined promises of radical change with reassurances that private property would be protected, appealing to both desperate workers and frightened middle-class voters. Electoral support for the Nazi Party skyrocketed. From 2.6% of the vote in 1928, they became the second largest party in 1930, with 18.3%, and the largest party in July 1932, with 37.4% of the vote. The party's brown-shirted SA now numbered in the hundreds of thousands, engaging in street battles with communists and creating an atmosphere of civil war. Many Germans came to see the Nazis as the only force capable of preventing a communist revolution. The economic crisis also helped the Communist Party grow, which ironically helped Hitler by frightening middle-class and conservative Germans. Business leaders and large landowners, traditionally suspicious of Hitler's radical nationalism, began to see him as a potential barrier against communism. Some began providing financial support to the Nazi Party, though Hitler maintained the party's independence and continued to receive most of its funding from membership dues and small donations. The period ended with Germany seemingly on the brink of civil war. The Nazi Party had become the largest political party, but had not yet achieved a majority. Democratic parties were increasingly discredited, while both Nazi and communist paramilitaries fought in the streets. The Weimar Republic's last chancellors governed through emergency decrees, as normal parliamentary government had become impossible. Conservative elites, including those close to President Hindenburg, began to consider bringing Hitler into the government, believing they could tame him by making him part of the system. By late 1932, despite a slight decline in Nazi electoral support in the November elections, the stage was set for Hitler's appointment as chancellor. The combination of economic devastation, political paralysis, and fear of communism had created conditions where many Germans and, crucially, many conservative leaders were willing to accept Hitler as a solution to the crisis. The rise of Hitler and the fall of democracy. The final steps of Hitler's rise to power demonstrated how a democracy could be destroyed through a combination of legal maneuvering, political miscalculation, and strategic violence. Despite the Nazi Party's slight decline in the November 1932 elections, a series of behind-the-scenes negotiations would ultimately hand Hitler the chancellorship. Key conservative figures, particularly former Chancellor Franz von Papen, convinced President Hindenburg that Hitler could be controlled if brought into a conservative-dominated cabinet. Their plan was to harness Hitler's popular support while limiting his actual power by surrounding him with conservative ministers. Von Papen, who would serve as vice-chancellor, famously boasted, "We've hired him for our act. Within 2 months, we will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak." On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. The cabinet included only 2 other Nazis, Wilhelm Frick as Interior Minister and Hermann Göring as Minister without portfolio. The conservatives believed they had succeeded in taming Hitler by giving him a position of apparent power while retaining actual control. This would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Hitler immediately began working to consolidate his power. A crucial moment came on February 27, 1933, when the Reichstag building was set on fire. The Nazis blamed the fire on communist conspirators, though historical evidence suggests the Nazis themselves may have been responsible. Regardless of who set the fire, Hitler seized the opportunity to convince President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree the next day. This decree, officially titled Decree for the Protection of People and State, suspended most civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. The new law eliminated freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right of assembly. It suspended privacy of postal and telephone communications, removed protections against unlawful searches and seizures, and stripped away individual property rights. These sweeping changes gave the Nazi government legal authority to arrest political opponents and suppress publications. The Communist Party was immediately banned, and thousands of its members were arrested. Other political parties faced increasing harassment and intimidation by the SA and police forces, now under Nazi control. The next election, held on March 5, 1933, took place in an atmosphere of terror and propaganda. Despite this, the Nazi Party still failed to win an absolute majority, receiving 43.9% of the vote. However, with their nationalist coalition partners, they controlled a majority of the Reichstag seats. This would prove crucial for the next step in Hitler's takeover. The remaining opposition parties, except for the Social Democrats and Communists, who were already under arrest or in hiding, convinced themselves that cooperating with Hitler was the best way to maintain some influence. This rationalization would prove disastrous. The conservative elites, military leaders, and industrialists who had believed they could control Hitler were about to discover how wrong they had been. By the end of this period, Hitler had transformed his appointment as Chancellor into a position of genuine power, but the complete consolidation of his dictatorship still required one more crucial step: the Enabling Act, which would form the legal basis for the Nazi dictatorship. The consolidation of power, Hitler's rise to dictatorship, 1933 to 1934. The crucial turning point in Hitler's consolidation of power came on March 23, 1933, with the passage of the Enabling Act, officially the law to remedy the distress of people and Reich. This law effectively ended German democracy by giving Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the Reichstag's approval and even deviate from the constitution. The vote on the Enabling Act took place in the Kroll Opera House, with SA men intimidating arriving delegates. The Communist Party had already been banned, and many Social Democratic deputies were arrested or in hiding. Hitler needed a two-thirds majority to pass the law, which he achieved through a combination of threats, propaganda, and political maneuvering. Only the remaining Social Democrats voted against it. Their leader, Otto Wels, gave a courageous speech opposing the act, declaring, "Freedom and life can be taken from us, but not our honor." With the Enabling Act in place, Hitler moved quickly to eliminate all potential opposition. By July 1933, all political parties except the Nazi Party were banned. The trade unions were systematically dismantled and replaced with the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. Regional state governments, once independent entities, were brought under direct Nazi control through a process of forced coordination. The civil service underwent a thorough purge of Jewish people and political opponents, while universities were stripped of un-German influences. The press fell under complete Nazi control through Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Hitler also moved to secure control over the Nazi Party itself and eliminate potential rivals. The most dramatic example came on June 30, 1934, in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. In a series of coordinated actions, Hitler ordered the murder of SA leader Ernst Röhm and dozens of other potential opponents. The SA's power was broken, and the more disciplined SS under Heinrich Himmler became the regime's primary instrument of terror. The army leadership, which had been concerned about the SA's power, approved of these murders. Their support was crucial because on August 2, 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler had already prepared for this moment. Instead of calling new elections, he combined the offices of Chancellor and President into a new position, Führer and Reich Chancellor. The army was required to swear a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler, not to the Constitution or the state. This period also saw the beginning of systematic persecution of Jewish Germans. The regime initiated this process with the April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses, followed by the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which excluded Jews from government jobs. The persecution intensified with the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews. By the end of 1934, Germany had been transformed from a democracy into a totalitarian dictatorship. Opposition was silenced, institutions were Nazified, and Hitler had achieved absolute power. The speed of this transformation was remarkable. It took less than 2 years from Hitler's appointment as Chancellor to establish complete control. The German people's reaction to these changes varied. Many supported Hitler, seeing economic improvements, largely due to rearmament and public works programs, as validation of his leadership. Others remained passive, either out of fear or indifference. Those who might have resisted found themselves isolated and powerless against the regime's machinery of repression. The complexity behind Hitler's rise to power. The rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party was not inevitable, but resulted from a complex interplay of historical, economic, political, and social factors. Understanding these factors is crucial for recognizing how democracies can be undermined and how similar patterns might emerge in other contexts. Economic instability played a pivotal role in creating conditions favorable to extremism. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed middle-class savings and undermined faith in democratic governance. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, many Germans had already experienced severe economic hardship once before. This second economic crisis made radical solutions appear more acceptable to a desperate population. The Weimar Republic's inability to address these economic crises effectively undermined its legitimacy and made alternatives to democracy seem increasingly attractive. The weakness of democratic institutions and traditions in Germany created vulnerabilities that Hitler exploited. The Weimar Republic was Germany's first experiment with democracy, and many Germans still associated democratic governance with military defeat and national humiliation. Conservative elites, including industrialists, military leaders, and civil servants, never fully accepted democratic values and were willing to undermine the Republic when it suited their interests. The judicial system, staffed largely by conservative judges from the imperial period, often treated right-wing extremists with remarkable leniency while dealing harshly with left-wing activists. The Nazi Party's sophisticated propaganda machinery proved remarkably effective at exploiting these vulnerabilities. Under Goebbels' direction, the party developed modern mass communication techniques that combined emotional appeals with simple, repeated messages. They tailored their message to different audiences while maintaining consistent themes of national renewal and racial struggle. The party's propaganda depicted Hitler as a strong leader who could restore German greatness, appealing to widespread desires for national redemption. The strategic use of violence and intimidation complemented the party's legal political activities. The SA's street violence created an atmosphere of chaos that made many Germans receptive to promises of restored order. Yet the party maintained enough distance from this violence to present itself as a legitimate political force. This dual strategy allowed the Nazis to intimidate opponents while avoiding alienating potential supporters among the middle class. Hitler's ability to exploit legal mechanisms for anti-democratic ends proved crucial. Rather than attempting another violent coup after 1923, he worked within the democratic system to destroy it. The Nazis used electoral success to gain power, then used that power to dismantle democratic institutions through seemingly legal means. The Enabling Act, passed by the Reichstag itself, provided a legal facade for the establishment of dictatorship. Traditional conservative elites played a crucial role in Hitler's rise through their miscalculation that they could control him. Business leaders provided financial support, believing Hitler would suppress labor unions while protecting private property. Conservative politicians like von Papen and Hindenburg brought Hitler into government, convinced they could tame him. The military leadership accepted the destruction of democracy in exchange for promises of rearmament. These groups discovered too late that they had critically underestimated Hitler's ruthlessness and political skill. The international context also facilitated Hitler's rise. Western democracies, traumatized by World War I and focused on their own economic problems, failed to respond effectively to the Nazi threat. The Treaty of Versailles created legitimate German grievances that Hitler could exploit while being harsh enough to weaken German democracy. The fear of communism, particularly among middle-class Germans and international observers, led many to see Hitler as an acceptable alternative to a potential communist revolution. These factors combined to create conditions in which a democratic society could be transformed into a totalitarian dictatorship with remarkable speed and initially with minimal resistance. Understanding this process remains relevant for protecting democratic institutions from similar threats in the modern world.